Hello, and welcome to the second of our podcasts on the changes in cost of living that are going on at the moment. As those of you who joined us last month will know that we're updating people monthly with our latest insights from our various data sets to see if we can try and lift the lid on what's really going on behind the headlines that you might be seeing in the press. So Hannah and I today are joined by my colleague James, who's going to do a bit of a deep dive in the next section. But yeah, it's been a turbulent time in politics since we last met, and whilst there seem to be many causes of what's going on, clearly cost of living is a serious factor that keeps coming up in the discussions. And yeah, it does seem that now is a time that cost of living and addressing the cost of living is a key issue. So for those of you who joined last time, they'll be aware that we put up a slide, which actually I'm going to ask James, can you put onto the slide our latest scenario of how we think the changes in cost of living are likely to impact different demographic groups. Very quick refresher, the left-hand side is the percentage impact that we believe the changes of cost of living will have on people's disposable income over the year ahead. Basically, light blue on the left-hand side means change of less than 1.5%. So you can see quite a lot on the left-hand side of the more affluent groups higher up the Acorn scale are impacted, but less so than those ones at the bottom, where the larger numbers of colours into the sort of dark greens there are losing 7.5 to 10% of their disposable income. But that left-hand side was the world before the now former Chancellor stepped in and did his mini budget package to give £400 rebate to everyone and £650 additional to the lowest income groups. We argued last time that change has smoothed the Acorn profile, has still left some, particularly at the bottom, the struggling estates and difficult circumstances, still being fairly heavily hit. Then there's this sort of squeezed middle group. And we also touched on city sophisticates, quite affluent urban groups who, because of their high rent levels, are still being squeezed quite hard. That's the scenario we did last month. Quite frankly, there's been a huge amount of noise in the press. I've been hearing things about, double-digit inflation. I've been hearing stuff around the energy rise is going to be even higher. But quite frankly, I don't think there's anything consistent and solid enough that we can say that we should change this forecast. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to James, who's basically taken this forecast and started to localise it. So over to you, James.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, hi, and thanks for inviting me on. It's great to be here. I think it's interesting. When you look at a slide like that, and we start to talk about the lavish lifestyles, the executive wealth. We would always hope when we're talking with these people that you can visualise the sorts of neighbourhoods that we're talking about. But it's when we put it all together geographically and start to understand where in the country we're going to start to be seeing the impacts. And so what I've been doing since you last presented that was running it through some of our catchment models here at CACI, just to understand what sorts of places are going to be impacted the most. And it's some really interesting results actually. It's probably no surprise. Either of you would be surprised that London sort of comes up as as very much one of the we see the highest impacts. If you just to say, look, what's the places that have the highest proportion of people with, let's say, a 5% decrease in their cost of living, or more, and it's London that really comes through there very highly, as we know, because obviously the cost of living is higher, the rents and the sort of things, so there's much sort of less room for manoeuvre when we start to play around with those costs. And so as I say, but within London, even that's interesting because it's not necessarily always the places that you'd think of. I just to remind myself of where the top 10 are, but I think sort of it's interesting that places like Kensington come up quite high, which people say, well, Kensington, that's quite posh, isn't it? Surely they're going to be insulated from from these impacts, but actually no, it's a very polarized area, Kensington, and while there are some of the super affluent in there, there's also an awful lot of people who aren't, and I think that you really see those differences coming through. So places like Kensington or Brixton as well, very coming up much higher within London as places which are going to see a greater than 5% impact on disposable income. which I just think is interesting, because I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of those places as being the highest. I don't know what you think about that, but certainly
it doesn't surprise me at all, to be honest, James. I mean, obviously we want to take the conversation beyond London as well, because there are impacts all over the country, but it
100%,
really doesn't surprise me that, particularly given all the noise in the press recently that we've heard about people literally having to submit CVs for their children so that they can get rented accommodation in London, and how competitive that has gone. It's really kind of, I mean, and it's pushed the prices up even more, because there's that supply and demand problem. So yeah, it's unsurprising. It's a little bit bleak, but yeah, it makes sense with what the news has been saying.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you say that, and it makes me realise, this is why I live in Leeds. I don't join you guys living in London. People ask me why I do that. You hear stories like that, and you say, well, this is why I live this lifestyle of travelling between the two. But no, exactly. I think it's fascinating how that bears out. And yeah, obviously we don't want to be London centric here. So let's, if I just sort of have to think about where else, in the country, and actually outside of London, it's really interesting that the dynamic changes a bit. And what we're sort of seeing is that whereas the major city centres, I don't want to bang on about Leeds all the time, but someone like Leeds is reasonably resilient. It's some of the satellite places, so the places on the outskirts, that I think are going to be hit the hardest by this. And this is where you start to see places like Boston in Lincolnshire coming up very high. That's actually probably the highest, I think, of all the centres outside of London, where we're going to see more of the people towards the right hand side of Paul's graphs. So Boston, Wisbech, Scunthorpe, Gravesend, places which are not the dominant town within their area, maybe. Apologies for anybody who comes from there, who obviously would always think that they are the dominant town. But I mean, I can reel off a list, as it were. Below places like Peterborough, Luton, West Bromwich, as I say, you can sort of start to picture the hierarchy here. We're talking about what we classify as, satellite centres, as it were, rather than the major centres, is where we'll see those highest impacts. And I think that has important implications for the people who live there, and the people, the businesses, retailers, etc. There, I think start to realise changes in spending habits. I wouldn't want to be responsible for forecasting, specific amounts, but I think, it wouldn't be outlandish to suggest they're going to, those changes will be enhanced there.
Brilliant. Okay, that is, and obviously what you've done here is you've modelled that out across our entire retail footprint spectrum. So we can drill into that in more detail if people want to go into more detail on those things.
Yeah, in fact, actually, let's have a map. Let's have a look at a map and see, across the country, what sort of places are coming up strong. I think, I think it's really important to sort of stress that this is a nationwide impact. And I've picked out a few places like Boston and Scunthorpe, etc. But we're seeing other places coming up, across the country, inside London, periphery of London, outside, whatever. And I think also some of this tends to sort of draw your eye to the types of places. I mean, one of the ones that stands out here is somewhere like St Andrews, which again, why is that being impacted? Well, it's a very high student population, very, very polarized from that point of view. So yeah, it certainly sort of makes sense, when you look at it this way, of the sorts of places that are being impacted. And I also want to stress, this is by no means a comprehensive list. It's not ranked in any way. It's just places that are appearing near the top, and I thought were interesting to point out. But and also as we always say, Paul, Hannah, we can't do anything without showing a map. Us, those of us in location intelligence, if there's not a map, it's not a valid piece of analysis. So
That's what we always say, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah,
brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, James. No, very useful.
Okay, thanks, James. That's really, really interesting. And I guess we've been talking a lot about speculative data, and we've been looking at a lot of kind of future forecasts. We're now getting the benefit of seeing observed behavioural changes. And it's been that amount of time since the cost of living crisis really started that we're starting to see some early signs of what's actually happening on the ground. I think it was last month, Paul, that you mentioned that we've got 4 different key data sources that we're using to kind of understand how this crisis is impacting consumers. A big one of those things is transactional spend data. So observed transactions and sales across the country. Now, we were having a very interesting conversation this morning with our data suppliers in this. They had a lot of interesting insights, including the fact that the luxury market, for example, has been incredibly resilient to that change in spend. And where we're seeing, for example, high street brands with huge losses in terms of sales compared to this time last year, that luxury market is maintaining itself. And intuitively that does make sense, because obviously we know that the people that spend on luxury items are not going to be the most negatively impacted, as Paul, your chart proved at the start. Another really interesting thing that we found from that data was that actually 41% of people have not actually paid a higher energy bill yet. So we're yet to see how that specifically is going to impact people on the ground. And so whilst a lot of the speculation is coming through, there's still a lot left to happen before we actually potentially hit the recession that many economists are predicting. The final thing that I wanted to say about this was that a really interesting point was made about how lower affluent people are not likely to change their behaviour. And the reason for that is because they're actually spending on, they've already made all of those cutbacks and they're spending at the cheapest brands already. So their room to kind of trade down in terms of what they're buying isn't there in the first place. So actually the biggest swings in terms of behavioural, and brand preferences is going to be in that higher tier, those city sophisticates, those career climbers. We're likely to see much more bigger swings in brand preference for them versus those lower affluence people. So it's going to be really interesting to monitor. Next month, we're going to have Rachel on the podcast, who has been monitoring this transactional spend data, is going to be able to talk us through how the last 3 months compare versus the 3 months before that. And that's going to be really interesting, because we're finally going to see some real observed shifts in how people are spending their money. So without further ado, hold tight until next month. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Paul.